If you grew up in the 70s or 80s, you already know what I'm about to say. Nobody checked in on you. Nobody asked how you were feeling. You just figured it out. You walked home alone from school. You made your own dinner. You solved your own problems. And somewhere along the way, the world forgot to ask if you were okay. You didn't have a cell phone to call anyone. You didn't have the internet to search for answers. If something went wrong, you dealt with it. If you were scared, you taught yourself to stop being scared. If you were sad, you sat with it until it passed. That was your childhood, not because anyone planned it that way, but because that's just how it was. This video is about you, about a generation that was shaped by independence before they even knew what the word meant. A generation that society skipped over, sandwiched between the loud legacy of the boomers and the digital revolution of the millennials. But psychology has a lot to say about Gen X, and most of it might surprise you. Because what the world dismissed as neglect, psychology now recognizes as the forge that created one of the most resilient, perceptive, and emotionally complex generations in modern history. Let's start with something that most people never talk about. Gen X grew up in an era of emotional neglect, not because their parents were cruel, but because the culture simply didn't prioritize emotional connection. Families were going through massive shifts. Divorce rates were skyrocketing. Both parents were entering the workforce, and children were left to navigate their inner worlds completely alone. Think about that for a moment. A 10-year-old coming home to a dark, empty house. No one to greet them, no one to ask how their day was. Just silence, a TV remote, and whatever was in the fridge. That was Tuesday. That was every day. Psychologists call this Latchkey kid syndrome. You came home to an empty house. You learned to self-soothe before anyone taught you the word. You figured out how to manage fear, boredom, loneliness, and disappointment on your own. And while that sounds painful, and it also built something incredibly powerful inside you. It built resilience. Research in developmental psychology shows that children who learn to cope with moderate stress on their own often develop stronger emotional regulation as adults. It's called stress inoculation, like a vaccine for the mind. Gen X didn't get coddled, they got immunized against chaos. And that's why even now, when life falls apart, Gen X doesn't panic. They adapt, quietly, efficiently, without asking for applause. While other generations might freeze when the unexpected hits, Gen X shifts into gear. They've been training for crisis their entire lives. They just didn't know it had a name. But here's where it gets deeper. Gen X also developed something psychologists call hyper-independence. It's a trauma response that looks like strength. You learned that relying on others leads to disappointment, so you stopped asking for help. You stopped showing vulnerability. You built an entire identity around the person who handles everything alone. Think about the last time you were struggling, really struggling. Did you tell anyone? Or did you just push through it, the way you've always done? If you chose silence, that's not discipline. That's a pattern you learned before you were old enough to understand what it was costing you. And society rewarded you for it. They called you tough. They called you reliable. They called you low maintenance. But underneath that armor is a child who simply learned that no one was coming to save them. That's not strength born from privilege. That's strength born from survival. Now let's talk about something fascinating. Gen X is often called the forgotten generation, but psychologically, that invisibility shaped one of their greatest traits, the ability to observe without needing to be seen. While boomers demanded respect and millennials sought validation, Gen X quietly watched. They became the most perceptive generation alive. They were the kids sitting in the back of the room who noticed everything. The ones who could tell when a teacher was having a bad day. The ones who knew which adults to trust and which ones to avoid, not because someone told them, but because they learned to read people the way other kids learned to read books. Studies in social cognition suggest that individuals who grow up feeling overlooked develop heightened awareness of social dynamics. They read rooms better, they detect dishonesty faster, they understand people on a level that others simply can't match. Gen X didn't need the spotlight. They became experts at understanding it from the shadows. There's another trait that makes Gen X psychologically unique, their relationship with authenticity. Growing up in the aftermath of Watergate, watching institutions crumble, seeing their parents' marriages fall apart, Gen X developed a deep distrust of anything that feels performative. They don't do fake. They don't do small talk for the sake of it, and they certainly don't chase trends to feel relevant. You'll notice this at any gathering. Gen X is the one standing slightly outside the group, not because they're antisocial, but because they're filtering. They're deciding if this conversation is real or just noise, and if it's noise, they'd rather be somewhere else. Psychologists link this to a concept called authenticity as a defense mechanism. When your early environment teaches you that systems and people are unreliable, you stop performing for approval. Instead, you double down on being real. That's why Gen X has this quiet, almost stubborn honesty that other generations sometimes mistake for coldness. It's not coldness, it's clarity. Let's talk about emotional endurance. Gen X didn't just survive difficult childhoods. Many of them went on to raise families during economic recessions, navigate the rise of the internet without a manual, and hold together workplaces where they were constantly overlooked for promotions in favor of younger or older colleagues. They carried weight that no one measured. They watched the economy crash in 2008 and kept showing up to work the next day. They figured out smartphones, social media, and remote work, technologies that were designed for younger generations, and mastered them anyway. Not because they wanted to, because they had to, because that's what Gen X does. In psychology, there's a term called quiet resilience. It describes people who endure prolonged hardship without externalizing their pain. They don't post about it, they don't demand recognition, they just keep going. And that is the defining psychological signature of Gen X. Not loud, not dramatic, just relentlessly steady. But this comes at a cost. Because Gen X internalized the belief that their struggles don't matter, many of them never learned to process their emotions properly. They buried grief. They minimized their own pain. They told themselves to just keep moving. And now, in their 40s and 50s, many Gen Xers are quietly dealing with burnout, unprocessed trauma, and a deep exhaustion that they've never given themselves permission to feel. It shows up in small ways: the inability to relax on a vacation, the guilt of doing nothing on a Sunday, the strange discomfort that comes when someone offers genuine help. If rest feels wrong to you, that's not a personality trait. That's a wound you've been carrying for decades. If that's you, I want you to hear this. Your toughness got you here, but it doesn't have to be your entire identity. The same independence that saved you as a child can now give you the courage to finally let someone in. To say, I'm tired. To admit that you carried more than anyone should have had to carry alone. You don't have to earn the right to rest. You don't have to justify taking care of yourself. The kid who survived all of that deserves to finally be looked after, even if the person doing the looking after is you. There's one more thing psychology reveals about Gen X that deserves attention. Despite being called the slacker generation in the 90s, Gen X actually holds more leadership positions per capita than any other generation right now. They run companies, raise families, and care for aging parents, often all at the same time. They are the backbone that nobody talks about. They don't lead with noise, they lead with competence. They don't demand loyalty, they earn it by showing up day after day, doing the work that others won't do. And they do it without a personal brand, without a podcast about their journey, without a single viral tweet about how hard they work. And maybe that's the most Gen X thing of all. Doing everything, holding everything together, and never once expecting a thank you. So, if you're Gen X, or if you were raised by one, understand this. You are not the forgotten generation. You are the generation that kept going when no one was watching. And psychology doesn't call that forgettable. Psychology calls that extraordinary. If this resonated with you, leave a comment and tell me what's the most Gen X thing about you. And if you want more content like this, subscribe to Not Lazy Just Deep, because understanding yourself is never a waste of time.